Well, as the Russian troops continue their invasion of Ukraine, it appears that it is the US that is leading the reaction of the West. Already we've seen the US giving Ukraine aid and imposing sanctions on Russia. There are also American soldiers being sent to Poland, I suppose essentially to stand on the border between Ukraine and the border with NATO. Siviwe Rikhotso is a researcher in geopolitics and foreign policy at the African Center for the Study of the US. Siviwe, good afternoon to you. It's fascinating to see the US reacting in this way. They're doing everything they can to contain Russia, but they're not sending soldiers into Ukraine itself. What's driving that strategy?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Good afternoon to your viewers. So what we can make of this is that the U.S. currently is trying to implore, or rather use every diplomatic tool in its handbag at the moment to try and call for peace and make sure that the situation in the Ukraine does not escalate to a point where they have to bring in military. But of course, remember, the U.S. in and of itself, and through NATO, as well as through the U.S. Security Council, acts with a number of member countries or member states, right? As much as these are in agreement on the situation in the Ukraine, they need to make sure that whatever decision is taken and whatever action is taken needs to secure civilian lives and make sure that on a humanitarian level, that everything is measured correctly and accurately.
So, I mean, there are all sorts of diplomatic phrases people use. Sometimes they use the phrase of proportional response. The other is, of course, no one wants to lose control of this situation. No one wants to enter a phase like we did during the Cold War, where people were very worried about what a nuclear war would look like.
Certainly. I think so. That's what we're also seeing here, that the U.S., along with other dominant powers, predominantly the UK and France, are trying to avoid such a situation, taking us back to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So now what they can do, and at least this is within the UN Security Council or UN level, right? They tried to call for a resolution last week Friday, as you've seen, with Russia vetoing that resolution, that would have Russia withdraw its troops from the Ukraine. So I suppose a mechanism that they came up with, and this has been a long time coming, is to call for an emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly, right? As much as the resolutions in the UN General Assembly are not binding, these do have political weight, as we've seen in the 2014 annexation of Crimea, that the UN resolution, UN General Assembly resolution, found that Russia's status or Crimea's status for independence was invalid. So this is what they're trying to bring to the fore here, to fight Russia, not using hard power as one would normally expect it to be, because this could easily escalate, and taking into President Putin's statements over the weekend and over the past week on making sure that nuclear missiles are ready and are on alert. This has brought serious concern to global powers, to the West, rather. So they try by all means to make sure that they come to a situation or a scenario where this situation is diffused, right, without having gone to war.
How does all of this play out in U.S. domestic politics? I mean, does all of this strengthen the President Joe Biden, at least in the short term? Is it even too soon to have that conversation?
Well, I suppose that for President Biden at this point, he has to make sure, as you stated earlier, that he does not lose this debate, right, this situation. The U.S. and the West cannot lose this to Russia, because should that happen, it's looking likely that domestic politics in the U.S. And specifically the opposition, the Republicans, might find this as an opportunity to ask the president come the next presidential elections in at least the next 5 years. So what we're seeing here is that President Biden, as much as he wants to take action on this, he needs to consider both the domestic elements as well as the foreign elements in this situation.
It seems to me that there's no way the West really wins here. They may be able to make Russia poorer, to kick Russia out of the SWIFT financial system, the banking system, impose sanctions, but Russia will use force and the West won't. I mean, isn't it as simple as that in a way?
Seemingly that looks like the case, but we have to consider here that President Putin was using hard power, so to speak. There's a lot that's riding on the soft power, as we've seen in terms of the economic sanctions placed on Russia. But more importantly, from an international perspective, we're seeing that the U.S. or the West world is trying to isolate Russia in the international community. And having done this, Russia will become an isolated state. Some would even call it a pariah state in a sense. But what we're looking for here, or what we are seeing here, is that the U.S., seeing that it cannot necessarily use military reaction or military responses to the situation, it will look for a sense of isolating Russia. But we also need to look at that in that aspect, that we have China here, which is quietly backing Russia. We have most of the Gulf states seemingly quiet on this matter, right? Here in the continent as well, we're seeing a high number of confusion and sometimes contradictory statements amongst heads of state as well as their representatives in these multilateral institutions.
Siviwe Rikhotso, thank you. As researcher in geopolitics and foreign policy at the African Center for the Study of the U.S. I really do appreciate the time. Well.